I want to speak to David Spencer, who's Head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. David, I can see the logic of a lot of this in regard to overcrowded prisons, a just criminal justice system that's not working. But is it fair?
Good afternoon, Peter. Good to speak to you. I think we can all see some of the reasons behind this. In complete fairness, the government 10 months ago took over a criminal justice system, and particularly a prison system, which is undoubtedly still in complete crisis. So I don't think anyone doubts the need for something to be done. I think the real challenge here is whether the steps that are being proposed are the right ones. And I think if we start from the perspective of what do the public expect from a criminal justice system, certainly when we at Policy Exchange have polled this, as we published on just a couple of months ago, there is a real expectation that what the public want is for the system to be tougher on crime. And I'm really doubtful whether much of what's in this review is going to answer what the public is really looking for.
It could actually be the opposite of that, couldn't it? There could be a lot of people who look at this and say, well, actually, you're rewarding prisoners for following the rules, which of course we want them to do, and perhaps they should have some incentive. But actually, if you say, a judge says you're sentenced to 10 years, and actually the time you spend behind bars is 3 years and 4 months if you do what you're saying. There's a big difference between that, and of course getting out into the community and being under supervisory orders and having to sign in and go and see probation officers and so on, that is a restriction on your liberty, but you're still free. And there'll be lots of victims of crime who say, hold on a second here, you go through the whole process of finally getting a court date, going through, getting all that done, and people actually not spending that long behind bars. It doesn't seem fair, I would imagine, to a number of people.
I'm quite sure that's true, and we recommended fairly recently that what the government is calling the earned early release model is a good model. I think it's probably the right one to be taking rather than automatic release, so that prisoners have to earn the opportunity to leave prison early. And that means that they have to comply with rehabilitation, they have to comply with rehab, they have to comply with training so they can then go out and get a job when they're done. But for that to be something they qualify for after only a third of their sentence seems to me very, very early indeed. And I think most victims of crime would feel that doesn't reflect the way they think the justice system should be operating. Now, the government have done some good things in this, or the independent review have suggested some good things here. They've suggested more open prisons. They've suggested or put a focus on more foreign national offenders being deported. And of course, the government has announced a further 14,000 prison places over the coming years. But the reality is that when you look at this review and the government's decisions so far in the round, they're just not going far enough to be tough on crime in the way the public expect.
What do they need to do, in your opinion, David?
Well, the first thing is that they've committed to 14,000 prison places. The reality is over the next decade, that isn't going to be enough, and we've modelled that. I think we also need to look at the entire early release model as well. But the most important thing they could do, above and beyond everything else, is have a look at how we're dealing with the most prolific offenders. So when we looked at this at Policy Exchange, what we found was that the most prolific offenders, those with 45 convictions already to their name, 45 convictions or more, when they were convicted again of a crime, they were only being sent to prison on half of occasions. And it cannot possibly be right that these, as we call them, hyper-prolific offenders are getting away with committing crimes and not being sent to prison. And what's really disappointing about this review is that essentially these most prolific offenders aren't really dealt with by this review, and it certainly doesn't say that they should be sent to prison every time, which is what we think should happen, and I think the public would say should happen.
I'm kind of all over the place, to be honest, on short sentences, because I used to be a special advisor in the Ministry of Justice. I dealt with sentencing. We increased sentences under Robert Buckland, who was then the Lord Chancellor, for the most serious offenders. I'm not sure actually if that was the right thing to do, to be brutally honest, but at the time it felt like the right thing. It's interesting with short sentences because people get really annoyed that loads of people, prolific offenders, often doing things like shoplifting, 150 convictions for shoplifting, and then eventually, right, you get a 3-month sentence. You might spend 2 months or maybe even those 3 months behind bars. Those sentences aren't a deterrent. They may even harden someone to a life of crime. They're not necessarily effective in any way. But to remove them, well, there's so many people who say, I'm a victim of crime, I'm a victim of theft, burglary, or a shop that's had a shoplifter many times. Where is the deterrent there? I'm going to ask David Gauke about that a little bit later on, but I just wonder what your position is on short sentences, because this review essentially says if you're going to be sentenced to anything of less than 3 years, don't really bother.
Yeah, well, I think what they've recommended is there is a presumption against, and it still means the magistrate or the judge can sentence someone to prison in exceptional circumstances. The problem with that, and you've touched on it yourself, is when we look at other examples of legislation where these exceptional circumstances can apply. Repeat knife carriers, for example, there's a provision within legislation which says if you're caught carrying a knife for a second time, if you're an adult, then you should be sent to 6 months in prison. What we know is in a third of those cases, judges and magistrates don't send people to prison. So although the review says there's a presumption against short prison sentences unless exceptions apply, it seems to us, looking at the previous cases where this has been put in, that it's very unlikely that judges will end up sentencing. And as you rightly say, when you're dealing with people who have 100, 150 previous convictions, it cannot possibly be right that they get churned through the community punishment, the suspended sentence route yet again, which is why we at Policy Exchange have said those people should be getting a minimum of a 2-year sentence every single time they're convicted of yet another crime.
Interesting point from Leslie, who's texted me to say, "Hi Peter, do you think our human rights Supremo Prime Minister would allow this castration idea to go ahead? Is this retrospective for grooming gangs or Hugh Edwards?" says Leslie. Well, the idea, Leslie, certainly is paedophiles, but she makes a very good point. What about rapists, for example? What about people convicted of rape who are very likely to do it again in many cases? I wonder what you think of that and how likely you think that is to actually go ahead, even in the case of paedophiles, David.
Yeah, the numbers of prisons where this program is currently being used is very small, and in fact the number of prisons which the Justice Secretary said she was going to extend it to was actually a small minority of the prisons in the country. My suspicion is, and I don't know for sure because I've not spoken today to special advisors, but based on my recent conversations, I suspect this is an effort by the government to demonstrate just how tough on crime they are. And I suspect they'll be very happy in number 10 with some of the headlines. The Sun headline today saying pedos will be castrated. I suspect number 10 are not displeased with that sort of headline. My suspicion is that if we fast forward in a couple of years, that it's probably a bit of a mirage. And I think it's very unlikely we're going to see compulsory chemical castration of prisoners. But I could be proven wrong, but I'd be surprised to see that.
David, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate your thoughts. David Spencer, Head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. Do you think, Ciara,